She didn't move on fast because she forgot you. She moved on fast because she couldn't sit with what she felt. When someone replaces you quickly, it hits hard. It feels like everything you had meant nothing. Like the connection, the time, the memories, all of it was easily swapped out for someone new. And in that moment, it's easy to assume that she's completely over you, that she's already moved on emotionally, and that you're the only one left dealing with the weight of what happened. But that assumption is usually wrong because moving on fast isn't always a sign of healing. It's often a sign of avoidance. It's a way to escape the discomfort that comes after a breakup. The silence, the reflection, the emotions that don't have anywhere to go. Not everyone is willing to face that directly. So instead of sitting with it, they look for something or someone to fill that space as quickly as possible. And on the surface, it works. There's distraction, there's attention, there's something new that takes the focus away from what was lost. It creates the appearance of moving on, of being okay, of stepping into a new chapter without looking back. But appearances don't always reflect what's happening underneath because unresolved emotions don't disappear just because there's someone new. They get pushed aside, delayed, covered up by temporary feelings that feel good in the moment but don't address what's actually there. And over time, that starts to show. Not immediately, not in a way that's obvious at first, but gradually the excitement fades. The newness becomes normal. And when that happens, there's less distraction, less stimulation, more space for thoughts that were avoided before. And that's when the reality of the situation begins to catch up. Because the feelings that weren't processed don't stay hidden forever. They come back in quiet moments, in comparisons that weren't expected, in small realizations about what was lost versus what's now present. And that's where the difference becomes clear. Not in the beginning when everything feels fresh, but later when things settle. This is why reacting to her moving on quickly doesn't help because if you respond emotionally, if you chase, question, or try to compete, you're stepping into the same reactive space she was trying to avoid. You're letting her actions dictate your state instead of maintaining your own control. And that only reinforces the idea that she made the right decision. But when you understand what's really happening, your perspective shifts. You stop seeing her quick replacement as a sign of strength or closure and start seeing it for what it often is, a way to avoid dealing with what hasn't been resolved. And that understanding changes how you respond because you're no longer reacting to what it looks like. You're grounded in what it actually is. When you see her with someone new, your first instinct is to react. Questions start running through your mind. How did she move on so fast? What does he have that you don't? Was everything you had really that easy to replace? And without even realizing it, you begin to compare yourself, trying to make sense of something that feels unfair. That emotional reaction is natural, but it's also where most men lose their position completely. Because in that moment, your focus shifts from yourself to her, from your growth to her choices. And the more you focus on what she's doing, the more you lose control over how you're perceived. If you react by reaching out, questioning her, showing frustration, or trying to prove something, it communicates more than you think. It shows that you're affected in a way that lacks control, that your emotional state is tied to her actions. And once that dynamic is clear, it changes how she sees you, not because you cared, but because of how you handled it. When a man reacts impulsively, it removes the sense of stability that attraction is built on. It creates an imbalance where one person is emotionally centered and the other is reacting. And in that imbalance, respect begins to fade. But when you respond differently, when you stay composed, when you don't chase, when you don't try to compete or compare, you create a completely different impression. You show control, not the kind of control that's forced or artificial, but the kind that comes from being grounded in yourself. You're not ignoring what happened, you're not pretending it doesn't affect you. You're simply choosing not to let it dictate your actions, and that choice stands out because most people don't make it. Most people react, they look for immediate answers. They try to regain a sense of control through communication or confrontation, but when you don't follow that pattern, it creates contrast. And contrast is what changes perception. Instead of being seen as someone who was replaced, you become someone who didn't react to being replaced, someone who didn't lose composure, didn't lower himself to compete, didn't chase validation. That difference matters because over time, how you handled that moment becomes part of how you're remembered. not just by her, but by anyone observing the situation. It becomes a reflection of your character under pressure. And here's where it becomes even more important. Your reaction doesn't just affect how she sees you, it affects how you see yourself. When you maintain control, when you choose not to react emotionally, you reinforce your own sense of discipline. You prove to yourself that you're not controlled by external situations, and that internal shift builds confidence in a way that no external validation ever could. So while it might feel like she has the advantage because she moved on quickly, the real advantage lies in how you respond. Because the moment you stay grounded while everything around you is trying to pull you into reaction is the moment you take your power back. From the outside, it can look like everything is going perfectly for her, a new connection, new energy, new attention. It creates the appearance of something fresh and exciting. And when you see that, it's easy to assume that what she has now is somehow better, more complete, or more aligned than what you had together. But what you're seeing is only the surface, because when someone moves on quickly without taking the time to process what they just came out of, they don't suddenly become a different person. Their patterns, their habits, their emotional tendencies, those don't disappear just because there's someone new in the picture. They carry forward. The new person isn't getting a completely healed, fully reset version of her. They're getting the same version that left your situation, just placed into a different environment. And at first, that difference in environment can make everything feel easier. There's no history, no past tension, no unresolved conversations between them. It feels light. But that lightness comes from the absence of depth, not the presence of growth, because depth takes time. It takes shared experiences, challenges, understanding, and communication. And until those layers begin to build, everything remains on the surface level, where it's easy to maintain the illusion that things are perfect. Over time, though, that surface starts to shift as the connection deepens. The same patterns that existed before begin to reappear, not necessarily in the exact same way, but in familiar forms. Communication styles, emotional reactions, expectations, these things don't reset overnight. And that's when the reality of the situation begins to show because the new person starts experiencing the version of her that you already knew. The one shaped by her habits, her mindset, her way of handling situations. And if those patterns weren't addressed before, they don't magically improve, repeat. This isn't about blaming her or placing fault. It's about understanding that growth requires time and reflection. And when that process is skipped, the same dynamics tend to follow, regardless of who the other person is. So while it might seem like she's in a better situation, what's actually happening is something more complex. She's in a different situation, but not necessarily a more evolved one. And that distinction matters because it changes how you interpret what you're seeing. Instead of viewing it as something you were replaced by, you begin to see it as something that hasn't yet faced the same tests, something that hasn't gone through the same level of depth or challenge, something that over time will reveal its own reality. And that perspective shifts your focus. You stop comparing yourself to what looks good on the surface. You stop questioning your value based on something that hasn't fully developed. And instead, you recognize that what you had and what you experienced was part of a process that doesn't get erased just because there's someone new. Because what looks perfect in the beginning hasn't been tested yet. In the beginning, everything feels intense. New conversations, new attention, new energy. It creates a kind of momentum that makes everything seem easy. There's excitement in the unknown, in discovering someone new and stepping into a situation that doesn't carry the weight of the past. And that's what makes it so convincing because when something feels good in the moment, it's easy to assume it will continue that way. The absence of past issues creates a sense of relief, a feeling that things are finally different. But what's often overlooked is that this phase isn't built on depth, it's built on novelty, and novelty doesn't last. Over time, the newness begins to settle, conversations become more familiar, patterns begin to form, expectations start to develop. What once felt effortless now requires consistency. What once felt exciting now becomes part of a routine. And that's when the dynamic begins to change because without the distraction of something new, there's more space. More space for reflection, more space for comparison, more space for reality to step in where excitement once dominated. This is where your absence becomes more noticeable. At first, it might not have registered deeply, The focus was elsewhere, the attention was directed towards something new. But as that focus stabilizes, as the intensity of the new connection evens out, there's a shift in awareness. She begins to remember, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that immediately changes everything, but in small, quiet moments. A memory, a comparison, a realization that something she once had isn't present in the same way now. And those moments begin to build because absence works differently than presence. When you're there, your presence becomes part of the routine. It blends into the everyday experience. But when you're gone, that absence creates contrast. It highlights what used to exist by showing what no longer does. And that contrast becomes clearer over time. As reality replaces distraction, she starts to see things with more clarity, not just about her current situation, but about what she left behind, about what was consistent, what was familiar, what had depth. And that's when perspective begins to shift because it's easy to overlook value when it's always there. But when it's gone and there's nothing to replace it in the same way, that value becomes more defined. This doesn't happen instantly. It's not something you see or control. It's something that unfolds naturally as the situation evolves. And by the time it fully settles in, the dynamic has already changed because you're no longer in the same position. You've stepped back, you've created space. And that space allows reality to catch up without interference because, in the end, distraction fades, but reality always remains. While everything is happening around you, her moving on, the new situation unfolding, the comparisons that might come up, the most important shift doesn't happen out there. It happens within you. Because this is the moment where you decide what direction your life is going to take, regardless of what she chooses. Most people get pulled into reaction. They focus on what they lost, what could have been different, what they wish they could change. And in doing that, they stay tied to something that's already over. Their growth pauses because their attention is still locked onto the past. But when you shift your focus, when you stop measuring your value based on her actions and start investing in your own development, everything begins to change. Not immediately, not in a way that's obvious to others, but internally, you begin to rebuild your structure. Your routine becomes more intentional. Your time is spent on things that move you forward instead of keeping you stuck. You start working on your mindset, your discipline, your purpose. And as you do that, your sense of identity becomes stronger. Now you're no longer defined by what happened, you're defined by how you respond to it. And that response becomes your foundation. Because when you consistently show up for yourself, when you focus on growth instead of reaction, you create something that can't be replaced. Not because it's perfect, but because it's real. It's built over time through effort, through self awareness. This is where your value begins to elevate beyond comparison. You're not trying to compete with someone new. You're not trying to prove that you were better. You're simply becoming better. And that distinction matters because when your focus is internal, your growth becomes sustainable. It's not tied to outcomes, it's not dependent on someone else's attention. It's something you carry with you, regardless of circumstances. And that changes how you move. You're more grounded, more focused, less reactive. You're not looking for validation. You're building self respect. You're not chasing something outside of you. You're strengthening what's already within. Over time, that shift becomes visible. Not because you're trying to show it, but because it naturally reflects in your actions, your decisions, your presence. People notice it, situations respond to it. And most importantly, you feel it because now your confidence isn't based on whether someone chooses you, it's based on who you've become. And that's what makes it powerful because, well, everything around you is temporary emotions, situations, connections. What you build within yourself is lasting. And that's something no one can replace because when a man focuses on becoming his best version, he doesn't compete, he becomes irreplaceable. At some point, something shifts that changes how you see everything. It's not about her anymore, what she's doing, who she's with, or whether she realizes anything. It's about you recognizing that your life doesn't revolve around someone else's decisions. And once that realization settles in, your entire mindset begins to evolve. Most people stay tied to outcomes. They keep thinking about whether the other person will come back, whether they'll regret their decision, whether things will somehow reverse. And in doing that, they stay emotionally connected to a situation that's already moved on. But When you let go of that attachment, when you stop waiting for an outcome and start focusing on your own direction, you step into a completely different space. You're no longer reacting to what happened, you're building something new because of it. That shift is subtle at first, but it becomes stronger over time. You start making decisions based on your own growth instead of your emotional reactions. Your priorities change, your energy is no longer scattered, it's focused. You begin to create a life that doesn't depend on anyone else to feel complete. And that's where real freedom begins, because now, whether she regrets her decision or not becomes irrelevant. Whether she realizes anything or not doesn't affect your direction. You're no longer looking outward for validation. You're grounded in your own progress. This is what most people don't reach. They stay connected to the past, hoping for something to change. But when you move beyond that, when you truly accept what happened and redirect your focus, you gain something far more valuable than closure. You gain control over your own path. And that control changes everything. It changes how you think, how you act, how you carry yourself. You're no longer influenced by temporary situations. You're guided by a clear sense of who you are and where you're going. Now, if she looks back at some point, she doesn't see the same person she left. She sees someone who didn't stay stuck, someone who didn't wait, someone who used the situation as a turning point instead of a stopping point. But by then, it doesn't matter because you didn't grow for that moment. You grew because it was necessary. And that's the real mastery. Not waiting for regret, not hoping for a comeback, but reaching a point where your life continues forward without needing anything from the past. Because when you stop needing her to realize your value, is the moment you fully step into it.